morning to all of you. It is a real pleasure to have this particular session, as I'm very excited about a book that just came out 2 weeks ago, and we learned only a couple of months ago about the book coming out. And while we were thinking in this session to go slightly different direction, we quickly managed to change our direction in order to include this particular conversation with some of the authors that are with us here on the panel today. So let me just tell you a little bit of what I think connects with our important theme of mediating wholeness in the broken world. Racial tensions, as we continue to experience in the killings of black bodies, health care disparities that are so clearly observable and during the last 2 years of the pandemic have been even more emphasized, political and religious fragmentations, socioeconomic and racial impact in food desert communities, disproportionate incarceration of black males all speak of terrible, terrible brokenness in the world still in 2022. And so that is why I believe that it is essential that we, in a very intentional and specific way, address the issue of race and racism. At least 11 authors are present here today or yesterday who contributed more than half of the 20 chapters in this book. And as I calculated, this could have easily have been an ASRS book, because I think about 18 of the 20 authors are ASRS and have been ASRS members. So it is indeed the pleasure that ASRS has the opportunity to speak to few. We had to restrict ourselves so that we have time for conversation, dialogue, discussion, and Q&A as well. I would like to briefly introduce, because some of these people are well known to many of you, briefly introduce some of the people on the panel. Maury Jackson is the editor, one of the two editors with Nathan Brown of this book, A House on Fire, How Adventist Faith Responds to Race and Racism. Nathan came to America just for the purposes to be with us, and then had an emergency with a family situation and had to fly back, so we couldn't actually eventually have him here on the panel because of his family situation. Maury is associate professor at HMS Divinity School at La Sierra University, and he also has, of course, PhD in the theology, ethics, and culture, DMin at CGU, CST, my apologies. Olive Hemmings, as I said a few minutes earlier, is a colleague of mine for many years at Washington Adventist University. I left her there, and now she chairs the Department of Religion. She has studied in the intersection of theology, ethics, and culture at CGU. Yishen Ma is a colleague of mine right now, and we teach ethics together at Loma Linda University. He also is co-director of the Center for Christian Bioethics and has his PhD in religion, ethics, and politics from Claremont School of Theology. Until very recently, Angela Lee was also a colleague of mine at Loma Linda University and was heading the whole program of the MS chaplaincy in the relational area studies. And since then, she has moved to the NAD, Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries, as Assistant Director for the West Pacific region. She has a PhD from Claremont School of Theology in practical theology. Greg Holmes is an academic and practitioner. Korean is a pastor and works in the Southern California Conference as West Region Director, an administrative role. This he's given 7 years ago. He's also academic, as I say, has been many times with us here at ASRS, and he has completed his PhD in practical theology at CST in 2021. I will not tell you about all of their interests because they will share each for about 5 minutes about their contribution and their chapter. Now, we also are privileged that we have another of people who contributed greatly to the book by writing a foreword to the book, and that is the Reverend Dr. Matthew Burdett. He is a graduate of La Sierra University with undergraduate and master's degree in religion and theology, holds a PhD in systematic theology from University of Aberdeen. He's also an ordained Episcopal priest and now serves as associate editor at Convergent Books, a Christian faith imprint of Penguin Random House. So I would like you to welcome with me this wonderful panel. The way that I have requested them is to maybe speak for about 5 minutes. Maury might do a little bit more because he has both a chapter and editorial work and initiative in this book. So if he does 7 minutes, I will not stop him. But after that, I would like us to have about 30 or so minutes for discussion, conversation. And if you will lack questions, I have written a bunch of questions for all of them. And so I will lead out until I see that there are questions from the audience. Jot them down so that you are clear and that you have concise, clear, quick, direct question either to one or few panelists. And that's how we will get really beautiful output from this session. Thank you. Maury, maybe you would be the first one to start. And I would say maybe after Maury, we'll go to Matthew as a forward person, and then we'll just follow the line from my left all the way to the end.
Thank you, Dr. Plantack. I remember co-teaching a class with you, and I wish I could do it again. Your energy is infectious. I want to begin by just greeting you on behalf of Nathan Brown, who co-edited this book with me, and he gave me a text message last night just saying he really wished he could share this time with you, and I'm grateful for his role in helping to get this together. I want to do two things. One, I want to ask the contributors who are in the audience to please stand. If you are a contributor and you are out there in the audience, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Kendra.
Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, indeed. This panel is somewhat like what Nathan told me about the book when I kept asking for other names to be on it. He said, we got to put covers on a book. And so we only had so much space. Briefly, I will say, Nathan contacted me after a podcast that I was on that the host is in Australia, and Nathan was watching the podcast, and he gave me an email, said, can we have a Zoom meeting? And so I met with him. I didn't know him, shame on me, but when we met, he had told me he read a few of my articles. He had asked if he could get a contact or get a copy of my dissertation project at Claremont, and so I had one sent to him, and he read it. He realized that I dealt with Adventist media, print media, and how they address contemporary moral issues after 9/11, the official media. And he said, you know, we're on the same page. So then he said, look, can we co-edit a book together? And I was excited about the project. I said, sure. I told him what I would like to do is three things. Number one, highlight people from each continent, habitable continent of the globe. So I want contributors from Asia, Africa, Europe, North and South America, and from the Caribbean, and from the islands, the Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian islands. And I want us to just make certain we address the topic of race from all these voices. That was one. The other is I wanted it to be from people at tertiary level institutions that were under unions, so that the world church could be able to hear from those voices. And we wanted to balance it out with female and male voices. And I also wanted I wanted to choose people who I knew had ways of reading scripture, theology, and our tradition that is faithful but wouldn't ring obvious to a common Adventist voice. And so when Nathan contacted me, he contacted me in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And he thought this is an opportunity for us to ask the question, how Adventist faith responds to race and racism. I wanted to add into the title, how mature Adventist faith responds to race and racism. But again, Nathan's a good editor. He knows what to edit out. But I want to say not much about my own chapter, other than Nathan and I tried to have the contributors give us what they were going to do. We asked them either from the Adventist heritage, what resource might we have, from biblical passages that matter to the Adventist community, what resources or doctrinal resources that you think might contribute to responding faithfully to the problem of race and racism. And then at the end, we decided what chapters we thought might be missing. And so I wrote a chapter on erasing sin, Adventist Christianity's Catholic vocation. And for me, denominationalism is the religious species of racism. And the irony is, if we're going to take it serious, we have to actually embrace the kind of Catholicity that we had in the early Adventist community.
Thank you. And I think that he's an example in 4 minutes delivering his 7-minute speech. Amazing.
You should hear my preaching.
Thank you. And I almost forgot about this chapter that I wrote. I forgot that there was a book coming out and I had contributed to it, and then it's about a year or more later, okay, I got to proofread again and saw some editing done on it and so forth. So I'm going back to it this weekend, perhaps this morning for the first time since I wrote it. But I want to say that what inspires my approach to Revelation, and let me say, for those who have not a copy of the book, the topic of my chapter is the spirit of prophecy and the call to resist, a closer reading of Revelation 19:10. And we know Revelation 19:10 is one of the foundational texts or verses in Seventh-day Adventism. What inspires my reading of Revelation, and specifically these texts, Revelation 19:10 and Revelation 14:12, is actually Jesus' own testimony from the oracle of Isaiah in Luke 4:18 and 19, where he's in the synagogue and the scroll of Isaiah is given to him and he reads from it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Of course, he reads from the Septuagint version. Because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to restore sight to the blind, to set at liberty those that are oppressed, and to preach the year of the Lord's favor. That quotation and that reading of Jesus from Isaiah has been the foundation of my own vocation and my own sense of vocation to the gospel ministry. What also inspires my chapter is the approach of two specific scholars to Revelation, Elizabeth Schusler Fiorenza and a Quaker scholar called C. Weiss Daniels, where they see Revelation as resistance to empire. And so this is how I read Revelation. I see Revelation as the ultimate prophetic call to resist. It's the ultimate prophetic call to the Bible, to resist the demonic forces of oppression in the world. And whereas many have undertaken to see Revelation as a book predicting certain things happening in the world, as a book where we set up enemies and use the symbols to demonize institutions and other things, I see Revelation as a call to resist empire. I approach Revelation from a literary, historical standpoint. It seems to me to address real people and real circumstances in a Roman Empire that was oppressive and that perhaps was the consummate oppressive state. And so that is how I approach Revelation. And so when I read Revelation 19:10, where it says, and I could have begun with Revelation 14:12, but Revelation 19:10, because we own that text. It says, "Then I fell down at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, 'You must not do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and your comrade who hold the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy.'" And we have owned that text. And many people, lay people, lay Seventh-day Adventist people, may come to that text from the standpoint of perhaps the prophetic call of Ellen White, but it's not referring to that at all, never referenced that. It's referring actually to the prophetic call of the gospel that actually is a continuation of the call of the Hebrew prophets to resist oppression as it appears in political states that are by nature imperialistic. And so the main call then is, as it calls to resist empire, it's a call to worship God. It's a call to allegiance to the God of the universe. And in that context, in the ancient Roman Empire, the main call in that socio-political context was a call to actually pay allegiance to empire. And those of us who may understand that Roman emperor himself was referred to as the Son of God. And so what we see there is, yes, 5 minutes is gone?
It's gone, yeah.
I can't believe it.
But you can give answers later.
Yes, so you should give me time when it was 2 minutes. I was talking so much. So what I want to say is perhaps instead of us busy calculating end times, matching symbols, and all this thing, and overlooking the larger message of how we relate to oppressive political systems, we need to actually look at Revelation in terms of the way we relate to oppressive political system. And Revelation speaks to real situations today. If we look at the situations that Revelation addressed in the first century, we have to see how it somehow matches what we're relating to today, the spirit of empire, as we see it even in Christian nationalism. We need to address those situations where, in fact, Christendom itself is becoming the empire and becoming the oppressive empire.
Thank you.
Hi, I would like to, first of all, thank Maury and Nathan for making the contributors panel very diverse. And My chapter is titled Creating Race and Other Creation of Myths. And I wrote from my location, which is a Chinese immigrant from Hong Kong with a practical theology background and training from Claremont. So I try to, when Maury approached me, I try to go back to my training and think about what happened, why it happened, and what I can do about it. So that's to stay true with my training as a practical theologian. So I examined and reflected on the religious practices of creation, and so that I can understand why and how racism and sexism were formed. And I also replied to Maury if I could write this chapter, also putting the gender equality or inequality in there, then I will write that chapter. And so he said, sure. So in the first paragraph, I wrote something like this to tell why I am interested. Because I was very curious. In Genesis 1:28, God instructed our first parents to have dominion over all living things on earth, and had nowhere that says that we are to dominate over another race, another ethnic background, and everyone's to be created equal in the image of God. So then, what happened since then? I was just very curious, so I kept thinking and reflecting, and if you're interested, you can read the chapter, but I'm going to just skim through to another part where I think that there is a myth of Ham being portrayed as a colored person. Therefore, slavery was legitimized for a while, a very dark place for a lot of countries, not just the U.S., and also the myth of Eve, where she walked away from Adam when she was tempted. That was also a myth that kind of held women as a second-class citizen, not being able to make important decisions because we cannot trust them because they don't make good decisions without men. So those are, to me, the origins of how inequality began. And so in my chapter, I also deconstruct racial and gender superiority in Adventism. And I wrote that those are sins, and so we cannot, as Adventists, uphold any of those practices that are not true to the Word, to the Scripture. Having grown up in a Chinese Adventist community in North America, the us versus them mindset was very prominent. It is always, a group here versus a group there, and things are supposed to be very black and white. And I, in my chapter, from my own experience, I see that that's not very helpful. So I reimagine, towards the end of my chapter, to have a house of veneration in love and peace. Only when we truly confess our sins and have the very intentional way of wanting to live in harmony, that's when we can truly live in love and peace. How much time do I have?
Oh, you have another minute.
Okay, thank you. So how can we align our actions with God's will? That is when I think we all need to take a very active role in reimagining how we can make our denomination a loving community to become peaceful again. If the world is not, or societies are not starting that, we have to start that. And our next generation really rely on us how to be good examples so that they can continue to live or they can have a more harmonious way of living. And so that's basically my chapter.
Thank you.
My social location as a relatively affluent, highly educated, heterosexual married male who is not getting any younger and is white, makes me an unlikely contributor to a book like this. So thank you, Dr. Jackson and Nathan Brown, for including me. My scholarship had been focused on food and ecology, and I was interested in questions around that, and through that process and the reading that I did, became acquainted with the idea of environmental racism. And essentially what environmental racism is the disadvantaging of people of color, and dominantly black people in the United States, in terms of their location environmentally. So it came about in the early 80s. There was a big conflict over where to dump PCBs, and they chose to do it in an African American community, and it really affected the community and the health of the community. And out of it, activism and agency was born, the term was born, and in addition to the idea that people of color are disadvantaged by virtue of the harms that they live next to and are placed in their communities, they've been shut down in terms of voice and vote. And so environmental racism names that fact and invites greater participation in the process. So I connected, actually it was Goshen Hodge who connected, in my mind, environmental racism and environmental justice with the same idea of anti-racism, racism and anti-racism. And so that correlate, adding in eco-justice, which has a sort of non-human component. Environmental justice focuses on the environmental harms done to human beings. Eco-justice focuses on the harms done to animals and actual non-human environments. And so these two concepts together formed the backbone of the argument that basically proceeds through my social location, helping people to understand that racism isn't something that you feel, like I don't like black people or something like this. Racism is the air you breathe and the water you drink. It's embedded in culture through white supremacy culture and white supremacy cultural values. And so I named some of those and the ways in which environmental and ecological issues connect along with the idea of chattel slavery and erasure of indigenous peoples and those kinds of things as you look at American identity. Probably the most important contribution of my chapter is the connections I make between American identity and the Seventh-day Adventist Church as an American sect, an American religious sect. Adventism carries American DNA. So whether we're talking about supersessionism or whether we're talking about the notion of this glorious land being our rightful inheritance, whether we talk about any of these sorts of things, Adventism is complicit and has participated in this wittingly and unwittingly. We were very socially proactive prior to Reconstruction, but acquiesced to Jim Crow laws following Reconstruction, had very little to say about the Mexican-American War, and almost nothing to say about the obliteration of the indigenous peoples as we moved westward. We've also been complicit in mission. There's been a benefit, I suppose one could argue, and certainly not all motivations were wrong, but we imported a white Jesus, and we imported a white culture, and we imported a white language, and these things made us heroes of the church, not villains. And so these are ways in which Adventism was complicit with the American project and with colonialism. And I try to name that as I bring this complex web together of racism and anti-racism, environmentalism and environmental racism, and of course, eco-justice. Thank you.
5 minutes, perfect.
First of all, I want to say just how privileged I feel to be among the contributors in the book, many of which are people that I've long admired, former professors of mine. But I say that only because if you don't like the chapter, you can blame them. When trying to write this chapter, I was haunted by a question asked by the late theologian James Cone. How could the same people who worshipped and crucified innocent God-man also enthusiastically tortured and murdered black and brown people? Now, this question haunted me for two reasons. I think in a very disturbing way, it highlights the capacity of religious communities for collective self-delusion. Now, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, I continue to be amazed by just the human ability to ignore the reality that is right in front of us. And secondly, I think it also tells me that before I respond as a Christian, right, who's formed within a particular tradition of Adventism, I must engage in self-reflection, critical self-reflection. And the community that responds also has to engage in collective self-reflection. So before we offer ourselves as resources for others, we must be first conscious of how we are complicit ourselves in our church beliefs and practice of racial and economic injustice and exploitation. In other words, Christians and Adventists in particular cannot talk about racism or anti-racism from a position of moral superiority or even complacency. So in response to kind of these two hauntings, I try to situate in my chapter racism within the long history of European colonialism. I wanted to do that because I wanted to make clear the close relationship between colonial racism and the emergence of early capitalism. So the European shift from an economy of the commons to one that is defined by economic expansion and profit accumulation between the 11th and 16th centuries, I think created the conditions of colonial political and economic realities. And I wanted to show that it wasn't just by accident that we have racial ideologies permeated our environment today, because part of it is that educated elites, the religious leaders, clergy, the religious institutions were participants and contributors that crafted the European cultural religious ideology of racial superiority. To say it very plainly, Christians are largely responsible for creating the racial ideologies that we are all familiar with in the United States. The European project of colonialism and conquering other people's lands and resources required a compelling rationalization during this period. So theologians came to the rescue. Other people are then labeled as lost, barbaric, uncivilized, or uneducated, or lazy. Some of the same categories we continue to see in our time today. And European Christians were conceived as coming to the rescue through their project of conquest and evangelization. So in my chapter, I try to show that this theological and political project resembles the beastly power of Revelation 13. I want to illustrate how we might be able to reread Revelation so that it no longer serves our faith community as a triumphalist Christian narrative that justifies that we're on the right side of history, but one that is conceived of as a form of warning to our community. I wanted to show that how Revelation 13 can be read as a cautionary tale of how Christians can reproduce the logic of Constantinian domination that characterizes other people as disposable, bodies to be exploited. So Revelation might also serve as a call for solidarity and resistance. So without first acknowledging how we embody the beastly powers as the church community and healthcare organizations, I don't think we can hope to undo racism, because we will always have a reason to perpetuate the narrative that enables us to exploit other human bodies. Thank you.
Matthew, I'll give you a chance. This, I don't know what Yishan was doing, but he ended. I just wanted to say 5 minutes on the second. I do apologize, Matthew, that I didn't draw you in after Maury. But I think it's good that it's fitting, because before you wrote forward, you had to listen to and read all of these papers. So your concluding remarks before we have discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so thankful to be here. On a personal note, my own entry into thinking about race theologically and socially really began in earnest in Maury's class back in 2008, when I was still an undergraduate student at La Sierra University with Vaughn. And that set me on a path to reading James Cone, about whose theology I dedicated half of the study of my dissertation work. So this has been a long project for me. But additionally, as you may have heard in the introduction, I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist, and so one of the questions that I hope to answer in talking about the book is also why I'm interested in it and interested in Adventism's work on this topic. So my concern that I presented in the foreword to the book has to do with a particular premise, which is that racism generally and white supremacy in particular is a primarily theological and spiritual problem. And if we begin with that premise, then the response to racism, especially the response offered by a set of theologians or biblical scholars, and of course just church people, ought also to be primarily theological and primarily spiritual. One of my concerns about anti-racist discourse, with which I have a lot of sympathy, is that often that discourse occurs only in a moral register rather than a theological register. Now, I think there are many reasons why I would want to suggest that church people and theologians of the church and biblical scholars who have a commitment to the church aim to make their work theological and spiritual and not simply moral, or treating these moral aspirations as self-evident. One of them, of course, is simply spiritual. So the tradition of which I'm a part, the Episcopal Church, states that the mission of the church is the reconciliation of all people with one another and God in Christ. And oftentimes, my fellow church people drop the "in Christ," and it doesn't go very well. The church is, in fact, the work of God. And if the work of God is the reconciliation of all people to one another and to himself in Christ, then the church's work of reconciliation is not primarily our work, but God's work. Amen. If we lose sight of that, we've lost our identity as the church and have simply become another organization trying to do some good in the world. And we always do it less efficiently and less effectively than everybody else. God has called us to the proclamation of the gospel in word and in action, and we must stick to that and trust that the gospel is in fact good enough and effective enough to achieve the ends that we're seeking. Second of all, the people who come to church, I would dare say, are interested in God. Pragmatically speaking, when theologians and biblical scholars and clergy put front and center their aspirations for justice or a moral issue, the people in the church, whether or not they say it, experience alienation. They're there for God. It is the responsibility of clergy especially to make very clear to people that their search for God involves these questions. If that is not made clear, the clergy have failed. Amen. Finally, it's an ecumenical project. Maury alluded to this, and this is why I'm here. God has worked in the church to reconcile all people. The church is divided. God is still making the church. The church's divisions are not reducible to denominational divisions. The church is also a racially divided reality, a nationally divided reality. The reason why our work needs to be spiritual and theological and not simply moral is that we as a church are also called to engage with other Christians on this matter. And we must speak the language of Christianity. And so I'm deeply interested in the work of Adventism because I believe that Adventists have a unique calling in the world and I think are uniquely positioned to do the kind of ecumenical work I'd love to see more Christians doing. And I love the chapters in this book, and I would simply say that as one engages with this book, the question is, in what way can this elucidate the fact that the God whom we worship is the liberator, is himself the reconciler?
Amen. Thank you.
5 minutes exactly.
I don't know how you did it. I'm amazed, guys. Since Maury Jackson took only 3 minutes, now he's asking me for more time, and I shall give him 2 more minutes.
I just want to read the first 2 paragraphs of the introduction and say that I've been blessed to be in a community of scholars at La Sierra who are better on this topic because they're not afraid to talk about it amongst each other and engage. While the traumatic and brutal beating of the late Mr. Rodney King, caught on tape by a bystander, was witnessed worldwide on television more than 30 years ago, it was before this age of widely distributed social media. It was also before the memory of this younger generation who witnessed the death of Mr. George Floyd. In the wake of this recent tragedy, we need our voices to join the call for anti-racism. Not only prophetic secular voices, but prophetic voices that emerge out of their commitment to a sacred tradition. Adventist Christianity holds to a contested sacred tradition that teeters between apocalyptic visions and prophetic visions. Both of these biblical visions bring moral and ethical imperatives that guide communal living as a community of faith and articulate voices for the larger world. While this book speaks to and within a community of faith, it also speaks beyond our community and into a world that houses all God's children. As our communal voices join the discussion around anti-racism, we cannot uncritically accept the definitions of anti-racism stipulated by popular voices.
Thank you. Lest somebody asks why we don't have potentially more African or African American representation on the panel, be assured that I have firstly reached out to some of those colleagues of mine, but unfortunately, again, for certain personal reasons, they couldn't be here. I will open up in about a minute or two, audience to kind of do Q&A time, and you will need to speak very loudly because it's a huge room. But before that time, I was really intrigued with several introductory concepts that also part of your presentation, at least some of you have mentioned the issues like anti-racism. So here are a few of the questions I'll throw out for you to pick on and choose to respond to. In the forward, Adventist confrontation with racism is a risk, but also a true mission of the church. Beautiful statement. I want to know what are those risks. The arguments are not monolithic, Matthew, and saying they do not represent a shared point of view. Love that. I wonder what you saw diverse in those, and you don't need to respond directly. Maybe they can kind of interact with each other as well as the editor. So that's one of those things. And then second point, not being racist is insufficient. This is direct quote. If I'm not mistaken, we are called to be anti-racist. As a matter of fact, committed anti-racists. So not being racist and being anti-racist are 2 different things, and I'd love you to unpack. 2 of you at least mentioned anti-racism in specific ways, and it'll be good to hear a little bit more about that. And then lastly for me in these introductory comments, has Adventism come of age? Has Adventism grown up? Has it been mature? What does it mean to come of age enough? Because this is the phrase that you're using. We've come of age enough. And as you said in your remarks, Maury, mature Adventism. What does it mean to be mature, and what is the immature Adventism? How does immature Adventism look like? So these are just few questions that you can choose to respond to, and then I would like to see if there are hands after that. I see one or two. Go ahead.
I would just say briefly about the come of age. I remember after 9/11 watching Cornel West say, America has grown big and it's grown strong. The question is, has it grown up? And that was my question in the introduction. Adventism is boasting bigger numbers, but has it grown up? And numerical growth and maturational growth are not necessarily the same. I also I want to make a comment about the differences and give one example. So everyone's not coming at it from the same way with conversations. In the editing process, there were discussions about the Hamite myth and the question of Ham and complexion. They're not all the same. I've read Sheikh Anta Diop and some others that do some etymological capturing of the name Ham as an Egyptian name for black and the Hebrew name Cush as a Hebrew name. And so there's been that discussion, but we wanted to let people engage as they understood and thought this, like the example of the Ham myth, or just questions of, is racism, does race come because of racism, or does racism because of race? And there's a lot of conversation. All of the contributors, I think, recognize that there's a social construction of race. Then the question becomes to what degree they articulate these connections. I guess I'll say that generally.
Anyone else on anti-racism or any other comments you might want to share?
As was just mentioned, the notion of race in general is a relatively recent project. It's something out of Western thinking, and it's a product of the late 19th century in particular, and the precursor, of course, to what took place with the atrocities in World War II. So just even talking about race and anti-racism is something we could unpack a little bit in terms of the meaning of those terms and whether they should be used and in vogue today. As far as we as creationists are concerned, there is but one race of human beings, the human race. There's mitochondrial DNA evidence that all humans come from one mother. So the notion of separate and distinct races is maybe something we ought to interrogate. But anti-racism in particular is a deconstruction. Anti-racism is the process of examining, I think as Matthew alluded to, our spiritual religious values, our theology and thinking. But it's also a cultural deconstruction. Because as I was alluding to, white supremacy cultural traits are deeply embedded in the air we breathe, our very DNA. An example is, for example, worship of the written word. And this manifests itself both in law and in theology, and in the way in which we then interpret them through our hermeneutics. I wrote in my chapter that the written word functions in Adventist settings in myriad ways, particularly the status or ontology, authority or epistemology, and meaning or hermeneutics of sacred texts, and noted that Western theologies have been adept at reading sacred text as an apparent justification for exceptionalism, genocide, erasure, and enslavement. So unpacking some of these things and deconstructing them is part of the anti-racism project as I have it.
So I kind of want to speak to the risks as well as an anti-racism. One of the things I try to do in my chapter is to really bring out the materiality, right? The lived, embodied experience of what racism is within how it's embedded within the structure of economic exploitation, right? So one of the things that I've always been reflecting on about is how corporatized so much of anti-racist discourse has become, such that we can have Amazon executive meetings talking about anti-racism while at the same time having horrific warehouse conditions for people who work in those warehouses as essential workers, which we know from the pandemic have been people who die in much higher proportions than anybody else, those of us who are professionals, professors who can zoom into our classes, right? How can we hold those two together, right? It looks like a contradiction to me, right? So we have people who's, and then primarily the people who are essential workers are black and brown bodies, right? And so we can talk about anti-racism in all of these professional contexts. I don't always see evidence of how it's translating into actual betterment of the material conditions and addressing the disparities that we actually encounter in our communities. One case in point in terms, also maybe touching on how can Adventism grow up, right? Across the blue zone of where I work, Loma Linda, right, it's San Bernardino. It's sometimes called one of the most dangerous cities in California, in the United States, right? How do we live with that tension, right? How is it that across the freeway we have people who live long, the longest living people, and then across the freeway there are people who barely make it in terms of their mortality rate is so much higher than anybody else, right? How do you live with that tension? And I think that unless we can really address how we are related to the others, right, in terms of our social relationships with them, I don't think Adventism can grow up, because the wholeness and the health and the body that we claim to honor in our theologies and practice end up being merely abstractions, but don't really have realities.
I'll give Olive a chance because she took the mic, but Mark Carr, why don't you throw your question in, because I saw your hand, and she will continue conversation that she had a plan, and then we'll move into your question.
Thank you, Zach. I want to also voice appreciation for being allowed to be involved in this project. My wife and I have this thing called yabbits, and we say no yabbits in this conversation. I'll make a point, she'll say, yeah, but she'll make a point, and I'll say, yeah, but, and as a white man, in conversations with other white men my age, that's always the response. White fragility, as is, the particular book, White Fragility, is worth reading if you're, yeah. So my concern is a hearing, rather than a simple dismissal of yabbit. And what might a strategy be, Maury, for making this book live now that it's in print?
Thank you. Olive will firstly continue our conversation, then Maury, you might want to take that on.
Just briefly, I want to say that racism is a symptom. It's a symptom of a deeper human problem, and the problem is spiritual, deeply spiritual. And that spiritual problem works itself out in the kind of anxiety that we have over survival, greed, the whole spirit of empire that I think Revelation and the other prophets, Hebrew prophets address. And as a church, whether we look at the church as a denomination or ecumenically, until we are, and I believe the Reverend sort of addressed that to some extent, until we look at the deep spiritual problems that as a church we are not addressing, that we move deep inside of us, how are we defining ourselves as creatures of one sovereign God? Are we defining ourselves in ways that are reconciling, that are helping us to understand that we do not need to have these systems of domination that we build up in order to deal with the anxieties we have over our survival? And so I think that, yes, we need to go to that spiritual place as far as the problem of racism is concerned. It is a symptom. Now, how do we deal with that? How do we address the root of it? So that's another part of the conversation.
You know, I would say that Dr. Ferreras asked the same question that you asked, Marlene, after seeing some of the panelists. We did a book launch at La Sierra University Church. She wasn't able to be there, but she watched it, and she said, Maury, the real issue is to ask, how are the issues you're discussing in the book operative in the space we're in right now? How do we see that operating in the space that we're in right now? I remember one time when Vincent Wimbush was the SBL president and gave his address on the racism in the Society of Biblical Literature, and watching a standing ovation, and then watching a couple of members of ASRS were probably the only two sitting and not clapping. And it became a consciousness on my part, what is going on in our guild? And I think this should have us ask those kinds of questions. How is it living out? How often do I like to tell my students, you know, the office of the deacon wasn't invented to take up offering, it was invented because of racism. You know, and we might say, well, they were, you know, Jewish mothers and Roman fathers, but the issue was we got deacons because of the problem of racism. And so there are gaps in this book, and one way to keep one other way to make it live is to keep the conversation. Me and my former student, now my teacher, Reverend Dr. Matthew Burdett, we see different on D'Angelo's white fragility. I'm more sympathetic in my reading, and I take time to engage against McWhorter and some of her critics. And he sees some of the critics as having more validity than I see. But staying in a conversation that we're willing to allow ourselves to be wrong safely and grow. These are ways I think it can live out.
May I say something?
Sure, briefly, because I have two more hands, but yes, please.
I'll be very succinct. Adventism has done an excellent job of taking up the ministry of Jesus corporately in healing ministry. Jesus' ministry was not restricted to healing. I would encourage Adventists to think carefully about what it means to forgive or retain sins and to perform exorcism.
Amen. Thank you. Nick Miller and then Jeff Gang. These are the hands I've seen so far.
So thank you for an excellent panel. And my question is, I think over the last few years I've stumbled perhaps haphazardly and maybe incompletely, but into a position of seeing the importance of anti-racism, of seeing that just not being racist isn't enough when you're dealing with history and systems that continue to the present day. We could all stop being racist, but certain people would still be harmed by the existing structures that were created by racism. And so I've used my platform at Andrews to try to speak to these issues, and have had some success in bringing moral, political, and even, because I understand something about our Adventist history, prophetic critique of our pioneers to bear. But I'm really challenged by our non-Adventist outsider who's come and told us that the effect and goal of all of this should be unity in Christ. Because most of the time I find my efforts, while applauded by certain segments of the community, actually making a whole lot of other people really mad and dividing rather than creating unity. And I guess I'm wondering if, I'm with Olive in suddenly seeing Revelation as speaking to the empires of the 18th and 19th and 20th century and the need to speak more about the abuses of colonialism and so on and so forth. But how does that language translate into reconciliation in Christ? And I want to hear a little bit more about that.
Thank you.
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? I mean, I was thinking as we're talking about the sort of definition of anti-racism, and I was sort of challenging myself here to think theologically about how to define it. And what occurs to me is I'm reminded that the devil is the one who scatters, right? And that to destroy the works of the devil is then to destroy that scattering. And one of the risks then of this work that Zach alluded to, I guess that I wrote about, is that indeed the efforts to do this work undermine the goal. They produce new kinds of division, new kinds of antagonism that are just as harmful. And I think if we ignore that reality, we ignore it to our peril. I don't want to sound platitudinous, but it's not lost on me that in a context like this, perhaps the person who's the true outsider is the trumper, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot safer to be up here and talking about race than saying, hey, actually, maybe political progressives are kind of problematic, right? Most of the people that I know who are involved in this work can't stand the people who they think of as racists. They don't like them, they don't love them. And as a Christian, that's a non-starter for me. Now listen, it's not a Christian mandate to like everybody. Lord knows I don't.
That's true.
But I don't think anybody is authorized to take up the work of judgment against another person's attitudes or beliefs unless they've come to love those people. I think a Christian principle is solidarity. And what does it look like to say, the person whom I oppose on this issue, the system which I oppose is populated by people who are my brothers, who are my sisters, who are people that I care about, they're my family. That's a commitment that I think requires us to think seriously about things like baptism, right? So, I don't know, again, I don't want to be platitudinous, but I think that there's something to that.
Thank you. Angela? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, just would like to share my thoughts on what Zach was asking earlier, maturity. So as a chaplain, when we walk into a room, we always assess the maturity, emotional maturity of a patient. Sometimes a 60-year-old has a less mature attitude than a 15-year-old, and it happens. So when you ask that question, I was thinking, okay, so what does that mean? In a sense, I think maturity in Adventism and maturity in personhood are totally related. When a person is emotionally mature, then spiritually they will also be mature. It's really hard to have one way or the other. So how would I see a person that is mature spiritually? They are confident, or emotionally even. They are confident, they are open and willing to face different difficult questions without sweeping things under the rug, and they're open to self-examine and self-reflect and even being critical of oneself. They're also willing to look into blind spots in the help of others who have a very radical different mindset or perspective, than them. And so, in a sense, immaturity to me is always self-preserve. When we want to preserve our own location, position, privileges, then we, in my opinion, then we are still immature. And talking about risk, the risk is sometimes when we are placing in ourselves and share our thoughts in a non-safe area where there are people that are still in the preservation mode, then the risk is that we bring ourselves harm when we open and share our voices.
Thank you. Jeff Gang, you had a hand. Is there any other hand? I'm trying to control the time. and I'm still doing well. We are doing well. We have 7 minutes minimum, unless I decide to go for a few more minutes after that. But I need to see hands, otherwise, all right, I see Friedbert and Zane. This will be the end. So Jeff, Friedbert, and Zane. Please, Jeff.
Yeah, so my thoughts are kind of along the line of Nick Miller's as well, and I appreciate all the panelists so much, and I just got my copy, so thank you, and I'm going to get into it as soon as I can. But my question is also directed to the Reverend Dr. Burdett. I deeply resonated with your 5-minute sermon. It was beautiful, thank you. And something that I have been wrestling with and thinking about these issues, and please forgive me if I don't articulate it very well, but something I sense in all of this that all of us involved in wrestling with this are dealing with is shame. And when I think of the shame that people of color experience, there's nothing more visual for me than the lynching tree. But as you speak of reconciliation, and as we think about trying to move forward and the church's role in that, it seems to me that all of us are, I especially think of myself as a white, middle-aged, Caucasian male, and I hear the pushback, as Mark was saying, that there's also some shame, there's some deep shame there, it seems to me that we cannot move forward until we confront the issue of shame. We think of family systems. In a family, it's dealing with trauma and abuse. They have to deal with shame. Everyone is experiencing shame there. So I don't know if what you have shared with us, if you have any thoughts on am I missing something there or anything you would.
I mean, Jeff, I agree with you. I think shame is debilitating. I think psychologically, when people are made to feel ashamed, they may, for a time, cooperate with the things that shame them, right? I think white people might take up anti-racism for a few years and do a lot of beating themselves up. And then, a few years later, the cognitive dissonance becomes so intolerable, you do one of two things. You just say, you know what, I'm going to avoid anybody who's different from me so that I don't have to feel the shame, which reinvents the problem. Or you say, to hell with it. If I can't help but being an aggressor, I'm just going to own it. And I think that this is an important problem to deal with. I think we've got to get past that binary option. Those are not options. One of the things that I take issue with in Robin DiAngelo's work is I think that it reinforces this problem. I kind of said to you flippantly, and I'll say it to everybody now, I think of Robin DiAngelo's work as saying, anybody who's not white, we can have a kind of Pelagian anthropology. Their racial identity needs no redemption. Nothing wrong with them, but you white people, let's apply a Calvinist doctrine of total depravity. Your whiteness is irredeemable. And I actually think a Christian account says, God made us good, we are sinful, baptism transforms us. The question is, in what way does baptism transform the meaning of being white? In what way does baptism, for me, transform the meaning of being black? And if I expect you to be transformed, but I think that I'm exempt, I've established a reverse power relationship to dominate you. And if I do that, you should call it out.
Thank you. Friedbert?
Well, I'm a student at La Sierra University. I'm sitting at the feet of my faculty, and I've learned a lot since I've come here. One thing I learned that racism is systemic. And I think that's what the book can do, create sensitivity for the fact that there is a problem. I believe we are an elite here talking about these issues, but there are so many out there in our churches who do not realize that there is a problem. Secondly, once you realize that there is a problem, there is the need for safe spaces to confess and talk about it. And one task for us is to create these safe spaces. My question for you is, as you look into the future, what are your dreams when it comes to the book? What can the book do for the church, looking at the church in 5 years. What do you think the book has done to the church?
Thank you. And maybe one should answer because of the time. We have one more question after that, so please feel free to choose who will respond to that.
I think Yishen should.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yishen has been volunteered.
Voluntold.
I don't know. I don't really know how to answer the question, so I don't know if I can do full justice to that. Well, I definitely think the book is, again, I think in my comments earlier, is I don't want to see this as a self-congratulatory project where, oh, now we can celebrate because we're finally addressing, racism. I want to see this as a beginning of a conversation, right? And I really appreciate what Matt said earlier, that unity in Christ requires hard work, right? And I think one of the things that we haven't really developed in our community is the ability to have generative conflicts, right? We often either do one or two things. We sweep something under the rug because it's uncomfortable, or we go into a reactivity mode where we begin to push various agendas without the willingness to be vulnerable and converse with one another, right? Both are risky moves. One of the things that I've learned as a training psychotherapist is the reality of trauma. Many of us right now, regardless of whether we say it or not, are traumatized by the reality that we confront on a daily basis. And what that does to us is that it makes us be sometimes the worst versions of ourselves. Not because this is our moral responsibility. There are just reactions that we simply cannot control, right? So I think we need to develop a trauma-informed way of having these conversations with one another, because we can never assume the other person saying what they say, doing what they do, comes from a place of depravity or malevolence. Because I truly believe that if we believe that we're all made in the image of God, there's a core of goodness within all of us that needs to be uncovered and excavated. And I think we don't have the practices for us to do that on behalf of each other and for each other. And what I'm hoping this book would do is to help us begin the process of developing those practices.
Thank you. I think that I promised time, and I'm kind of Germanic a little bit. My grandma was German, Lösching, and I like my time to be really strict. So I could easily offend my Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Dr. Zane Yee, and say, I'm so sorry. Each one of those people, you can keep on that conversation going, but I will actually stop it at this point. And I asked Maury Jackson as the editor to have the last final word, and then after that I want to thank the panel. Actually, no, I will actually thank the panel now and then have Maury finish the session. So Matthew, Yishen, Greg, Angela, Olive, and Maury, thank you so much. And those of you who are in the audience who have also contributed chapters, and other of our members, including Nathan, we're sorry you're not here. We love you. Thank you for the book.
Thank you. And I decided to allow the co-editor, Nathan, to have the last word. This comes out of his chapter. Most of the ancient Hebrew prophets urged their people to the faithful work of doing justice. To this, Jesus added a valuable promise. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. This is an eschatology of activism and engagement. As such, doing justice is a necessary expression of the hope we claim to live by and a response to the goodness of the God we claim to serve, as well as contributing to the necessary change in the world around us.
Thank you.